You're 21 years old and you're flying a helicopter into a hot landing zone with 12 soldiers in the back who are counting on you to get them out alive. The ground is exploding. Tracers are cutting through the air. Your co-pilot is screaming coordinates, and you have about 30 seconds to land, load the wounded, and get out before enemy fire tears your aircraft apart. This is your job. This is what you do every single day, and you're barely old enough to buy a beer. This is what it was like to be a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. This is the story that doesn't get told enough. Not about the infantry, not about the ground troops, but about the pilots, the guys who flew the Hueys, the helicopters that became the symbol of the Vietnam War. The sound of those rotor blades meant hope for soldiers on the ground. It meant extraction. It meant survival. But for the pilots flying them, it meant something else entirely. It meant flying into danger over and over again. It meant every landing could be your last.
Let me take you back to flight school. You're 19 years old. Maybe you enlisted. Maybe you were drafted and scored high enough on the tests that they offered you pilot training. Either way, you jumped at the chance because anything seemed better than being infantry. Anything seemed better than humping through the jungle with a rifle. So you said yes. You became a helicopter pilot candidate. Flight school was intense. Months of training, learning aerodynamics, learning how to read instruments, learning emergency procedures, learning how to fly in conditions that would make civilian pilots refuse to take off. And the whole time, you knew where you were going. You knew that when training ended, you were headed to Vietnam. You were going to war. The helicopter you trained on was the UH-1 Iroquois. Everyone called it the Huey. That name came from its original designation, HU-1. The Huey became the most iconic helicopter of the Vietnam War. It could carry troops, it could carry supplies, it could be fitted with weapons, it could do medical evacuations. It was versatile and reliable and absolutely critical to how the war was fought. But here's what they didn't fully prepare you for in training. They didn't prepare you for what it feels like to fly into combat. They can teach you the mechanics, they can teach you the procedures, but they can't teach you what it's like when people are shooting at you, when your aircraft is taking hits, when you have to make split-second decisions that determine whether people live or die.
You arrive in Vietnam fresh out of flight school, 20 years old. You've got maybe 200 hours of flight time, and they're about to send you into combat situations that experienced pilots would consider suicidal. But that's the job. That's what needs to be done. So you do it. Your first mission is terrifying. You're flying with an experienced pilot who's shown you the ropes. You're approaching a landing zone to insert troops, and as you're coming in, you see the muzzle flashes from the ground. You see the tracers, bullets that are coming at you, coming at your aircraft. Your first instinct is to pull up, to get away, but you can't. You have troops to deliver, so you keep descending. You land, the troops jump out, and you take off as fast as possible, while bullets punch holes in your helicopter.
You make it back to base, and you're shaking. Your hands won't stop trembling. You count the bullet holes in your aircraft. 14. 14 bullets hit your helicopter on your first combat mission. And you realize something that makes your blood run cold. This is gonna happen every day. This is your job now. Flying into places where people are actively trying to kill you. The Huey pilots developed a reputation in Vietnam. They were some of the bravest guys in the war, not because they were physically stronger or tougher, but because of what they were willing to do.
They'd fly into hot landing zones to extract wounded soldiers. They'd fly in terrible weather conditions. They'd fly at night with minimal visibility. They'd fly missions that had almost no chance of success because soldiers on the ground needed help, and they were the only ones who could provide it.
The life expectancy statistics for helicopter pilots in Vietnam were brutal. Depending on when and where you served, your chances of being shot down or killed were extremely high. Some units lost helicopters every single week. Some pilots didn't make it through their first month. And everyone knew the statistics, everyone knew the odds, but they kept flying anyway. Here's what a typical day looked like. You wake up at dawn. Maybe you got 4 hours of sleep, maybe less if there were mortar attacks during the night. You get breakfast, you get briefed on the day's missions, and then you fly. Mission after mission. Troop insertions, medical evacuations, supply runs, reconnaissance. You might fly 8 or 10 missions in a single day, each one dangerous, each one potentially fatal.
The troop insertions were nerve-wracking. You'd fly in formation with other Hueys, usually 4 to 6 helicopters. You'd approach the landing zone at low altitude to avoid radar and anti-aircraft fire. The door gunners on your helicopter would be scanning for threats. The soldiers in the back would be checking their weapons, and you'd be focused entirely on getting in and getting out as fast as possible. A hot landing zone meant the enemy was waiting. They knew you were coming. They had machine guns set up. They had snipers positioned. And as soon as you came into view, they'd open fire. The sound was incredible. Bullets hitting the helicopter sounded like someone throwing rocks at a metal roof. Constant pinging and thudding as rounds struck the aircraft. And you had to keep flying, keep descending, keep landing, because those troops needed to get on the ground.
The door gunners would return fire. M60 machine guns blazing, trying to suppress the enemy positions, trying to buy you enough time to land and take off. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the gunners took out enough enemy soldiers that you could land safely. Other times the fire was so intense that you had to abort, had to pull up and try a different approach, or call for gunship support. The medical evacuations were the worst. When you got a call that there were wounded soldiers who needed immediate extraction, you knew what you were getting into. You were flying into an active firefight. The soldiers calling for help were pinned down. They were taking casualties, and you were their only hope of survival. You'd approach the zone, and you could see the smoke from grenades marking the landing area. You could see the explosions, the muzzle flashes, the chaos of combat happening below you. And you had to land right in the middle of it. You had to set your helicopter down while bullets were flying, while mortars were exploding, while everything around you was pure violence. The medic and the soldiers on the ground would load the wounded as fast as possible. Guys with missing limbs, guys with sucking chest wounds, guys who were barely conscious. And you had to sit there, rotors turning, aircraft taking hits, waiting for everyone to get loaded. Every second felt like an hour. Every bullet that hit your helicopter made you wonder if the next one would hit something critical. The engine, the fuel tank, the tail rotor. Any of those hits could bring you down. And then you'd take off, pulling maximum power, climbing as fast as the Huey could manage, getting away from the ground fire, getting those wounded soldiers to a field hospital where they had a chance of surviving. Some of them made it. Some of them died in your helicopter before you could get them to help. And you felt every single one of those deaths like a personal failure, even though there was nothing more you could have done. The Huey itself was an incredible machine. It was tough. It could take damage and keep flying. There are stories of Hueys making it back to base with hundreds of bullet holes, with engines that were barely functioning, with control systems that were shot to pieces.
The pilots learned to trust their aircraft, learned to push it to its limits, learned what it could handle.
But the Huey had limitations. It wasn't armored, except for some basic plating under the seats. The fuel tanks weren't self-sealing in the early models. A bullet in the wrong place could bring the whole aircraft down. And the tail rotor was especially vulnerable. If the tail rotor got hit, you lost directional control. The helicopter would spin, and there was no recovering from that. You were going down. Every pilot had close calls, situations where they should have died, but somehow didn't. Taking fire from all sides and somehow making it out. Having the engine hit, but keeping it running long enough to get away from the combat zone. Losing hydraulics and having to wrestle the controls to make an emergency landing. These stories were common. Everyone had them. And everyone knew that their luck would eventually run out.
The crew of a Huey was typically 4 people: the pilot, the co-pilot, and 2 door gunners. These 4 guys became incredibly close. They trusted each other with their lives every single day. The door gunners watched for threats and returned fire. The co-pilot helped with navigation and called out hazards. The pilot made the final decisions and controlled the aircraft. It was a team, and that team dynamic was the only thing that kept them alive. Some of the most heroic actions in Vietnam were performed by helicopter pilots, flying into impossible situations to save lives, landing under fire to extract wounded soldiers when everyone else said it couldn't be done, making multiple trips into hot zones because there were too many wounded to evacuate in one flight. These guys weren't doing it for medals or recognition. They were doing it because soldiers on the ground needed them, because their fellow Americans were dying and they were the only ones who could help.
One of the most famous helicopter rescue missions happened in 1968. A pilot named Michael Novosel flew 15 separate rescue missions in a single day into a hot landing zone. He was 52 years old, way older than most pilots. He'd retired from the Air Force and then volunteered to fly helicopters in Vietnam. On this particular day, his unit was supporting a ground operation that went wrong. American soldiers were surrounded and taking heavy casualties. Novosel flew mission after mission, landing under intense fire, extracting wounded soldiers. He saved 29 lives that day. His helicopter was hit multiple times, but he kept going back. He earned the Medal of Honor for his actions. That story wasn't unique. There were thousands of helicopter pilots doing similar things throughout the war, putting their lives on the line to save others, flying when it would have been safer to stay on the ground, making the hard choice to go back into danger because that's what the mission required.
The psychological toll on helicopter pilots was immense. You were constantly in danger, constantly making life or death decisions, constantly watching people die. Some pilots flew hundreds of combat missions, day after day, week after week, month after month. The stress was unimaginable. Some pilots broke down. Some refused to fly anymore. Some kept flying, but the fear was always there, always in the background, always waiting. And the mechanical failures added another layer of stress. Helicopters are complex machines. They require constant maintenance. In Vietnam, helicopters were flying in harsh conditions: heat, humidity, dust, combat damage. All of these things took a toll on the aircraft. Engines failed, hydraulic systems failed, rotor blades cracked. And when something failed while you were flying, you had to react instantly. You had to know the emergency procedures. You had to make the right choices, or you were going to crash.
Auto-rotation was the emergency procedure for engine failure. If your engine quit,
You had to immediately adjust your controls to use the air flowing up through the rotor blades to keep them spinning. This gave you some control over your descent. You could guide the helicopter to a landing. But it wasn't easy. It required skill and quick thinking. And if you were over hostile territory when your engine quit, you were landing in an area where enemy soldiers would immediately converge on your position. Some pilots were shot down and captured, became prisoners of war, spent years in North Vietnamese prison camps being tortured and starved. Some pilots were shot down and killed on impact. Some managed to crash land and survive, but were killed by enemy forces before they could be rescued. The risks were constant and they were real.
But despite all of this, the pilots kept flying. They kept volunteering for missions. They kept going into hot zones. They kept saving lives. Because that's what they signed up for. That's what the soldiers on the ground needed. And they weren't going to let their brothers down. The bond between helicopter pilots and ground troops was special. The infantry loved the helicopter pilots. They knew that when things went wrong, when they were surrounded or taking casualties, the helicopters would come. The pilots would risk everything to get them out. That sound of rotor blades in the distance meant hope. It meant salvation. It meant someone was coming to help.
And the pilots felt that responsibility deeply. They knew that soldiers on the ground were counting on them, that their actions directly determined whether men lived or died. That weight was heavy. But it also gave them purpose. It gave them a reason to keep flying, even when the fear told them to stop. By the end of a tour in Vietnam, which was typically 1 year for pilots, you were a completely different person than when you arrived. You'd seen things that changed you. You'd done things that required more courage than you knew you had. You'd lost friends. You'd saved lives. You'd survived situations that should have killed you. And you carried all of that with you for the rest of your life.
Many helicopter pilots came home with PTSD. The constant stress, the constant danger, the deaths they witnessed. All of it created psychological wounds that didn't heal easily. Some pilots couldn't fly anymore, couldn't even be around helicopters without having panic attacks. Some turned to alcohol to cope with the memories. Some isolated themselves from friends and family because nobody understood what they'd been through. But many pilots also came home with a sense of pride. They'd done something that mattered. They'd saved lives. They'd been part of something bigger than themselves. They'd proven that they could face impossible odds and survive. That knowledge, that experience, became part of who they were.
The Huey pilots of Vietnam deserve to be remembered as some of the bravest people in the war. They flew missions that terrified them because soldiers needed help. They landed in places where landing was almost certain death because that's what the mission required. They kept flying even when every instinct told them to quit. They were 21 years old, and they were making decisions that would haunt them forever. But they made those decisions anyway. They did what needed to be done. So, the next time you see footage of a Huey in Vietnam, remember that there was a young pilot at the controls, probably barely old enough to vote, probably scared out of his mind, but flying anyway, landing anyway, saving lives anyway. Because that's what heroes do. They act despite the fear. They serve despite the danger. They give everything they have because others are counting on them. You're 21 years old and you're flying a Huey in Vietnam. Every landing could be your last, but you keep landing anyway. Because soldiers on the ground need you, and you're not going to let them down.